So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ebu Patel, the founder and president of Interfaith America. So under Ebu's leadership, Interfaith America has worked with governments, universities, private companies, and civic organizations to make faith a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division. Named one of America's best leaders by U.S. News and World Report, Ebu served on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council, has given hundreds of keynote addresses, and has written 5 books, including We Need to Build, Field Notes for Diverse Democracy, and his autobiography, Acts of Faith. And they are scattered around on your table, so we're really pleased to have them for you today. An Indian-American Muslim born in Mumbai, Ebu grew up in Glen Ellen, Illinois, where he attended Glenbard South High School. He received his undergraduate degree in sociology from the University of Illinois in Champaign. An Ashoka Fellow, he holds a doctorate in sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ebu Patel.
So today's one of those mornings when you wake up at 6 or 7 and you look outside and you think to yourself, I could live in Miami. I could live in Santa Barbara. I could live in Austin. But I live in the city where we have 4 seasons in 36 hours. And it adds character, it builds vitality, I think. So we're going to talk a little bit about how diverse religious traditions contribute to the vitality of our city and our nation. Let me begin with this. The United States is the most religiously diverse country in human history, the most religiously devout nation in the Western Hemisphere, and the world's first attempt at religiously diverse democracy. So just take that with you. There's been no political entity in the history of the world where more people from more different religions reside than the nation that we call home. It's a couple of interesting stats on this. So the number of Muslims is set to basically double over the course of the next 30 years. The number of Hindus is set to grow by about 50%, and the number of Buddhists are set to grow by about 25%. Let me give you a little bit of context for this. There are 4 million ELCA Lutherans in the United States of America. There's about 6 million Methodists, there's about 2.3 million Episcopalians. That means that there are going to be roughly 4 times the number of Muslims in America as Episcopalians in the coming decades. The median age of white Christians in America is 57. The median age of Hindus and Muslims is 36. We have lived a great chapter of American history called Judeo-Christian. We are entering a new chapter called Interfaith America. We loved the name so much, we renamed the organization after it. But I just want to give people a brief window into the demographic change we're going through. There's a lot of conversation about becoming a majority-minority nation. That's when it comes to race and ethnicity. That's exciting. We're going through an equally tectonic change religiously, and it is also exciting. And this is by design. This is 1790. It's George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. Moses Sessions, Jewish leader, late 18th century, writes a letter to George Washington when he receives the presidency. Congratulations, Your Excellency, Mr. President. What is going to happen to my people, we Jews who have been hated and hounded and harassed for hundreds of years in Western civilization? This is what Washington writes back. Happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Now we know how deeply the European founders were flawed around other dimensions of identity. I hate to tell you this, but George Washington had a mouthful of his slaves' teeth. But on religious matters, we would take what the founders said in the late 19th century today. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they all basically espoused the same ethic. Benjamin Franklin gave donations to every religious community in the city of Philadelphia, saying he only wanted them to come together to celebrate July 4th and to commemorate his funeral. Built a hall, and it said that the platform of that hall would be open to preachers of any persuasion. I quote, "If the Grand Mufti of Constantinople wants to send a preacher preaching Islam, this pulpit is at his service." Our religious diversity is by design, and it enriches this country beyond measure. So this is a map by the Bridgespan Group of the percentage of social service funding that comes from religious communities in 6 cities. It ranges from 30% in Dallas to 71% in Amarillo. And by the way, in this audience are people like Sally Blunt from the Catholic Charities in Chicago, Josh Hale from the Big Shoulders Fund. They are people who represent the civic contributions of religious communities. My friend Bria Lascota likes to point out that the individual congregation is the most commonly repeating civic institution in the nation. There are more congregations in the country than any other type of civic institution, and the kind of work they do is unbelievable. So of over 300,000 congregations in America, 130,000 are involved in addictions counseling. 120,000 are involved in some kind of job training. So here's the mental exercise I like to do with groups. Imagine for a moment if all of the civic contributions contributed by faith communities disappeared overnight. Just imagine if it was all gone. Okay, so let's do the exercise in our city. So here are some well-known Chicago houses of worship, right? The beautiful Baha'i Temple, Fourth Presbyterian Church, a masjid, a synagogue. These are places where people derive their meaning, find their strength, develop a community. They're also places that make sure that kids who get free breakfast and lunch at school don't go hungry over the weekends. They're also places who are part of AA and NA groups, meet on Wednesday nights. Fourth Presbyterian Church is the place my Muslim wife, Shanaz, did her Tuesday night tutoring. Right? That's what we do in diverse houses of worship across the city of Chicago and the country. But here's what else would be gone. Northwestern Hospital, founded by Methodists. DePaul University, founded by Vincentians. The Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, the Inner City Muslim Action Network, whose staff is almost entirely Muslim, whose board is almost entirely Muslim, whose funders are almost entirely Muslim, and the people that they serve are 90% not Muslim. Catholic Charities, outside of the federal government of the United States of America, the single largest provider of social services, Catholic Charities. Imagine if that just all disappeared. I think about this like that old poem that we all read in elementary school by William Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow. You remember that poem? So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glistening with rain beside the white chickens. So much depends on these things. What does it look like to not take them for granted? What does it look like to cherish them, to strengthen them, to bridge them? So this is the Economic Club, and part of what I wanted to do was bring home to people the importance of attending to religious diversity matters, not just in the broader society, but also within our businesses. The simple fact is, by orders of magnitude, the dimension of identity that is most protected in American law is religious identity. The Constitution, it's in the Bill of Rights, it's in the Civil Rights Acts, it's in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, and it's in Supreme Court jurisprudence for the last 20 plus years. This is a recent, very interesting case. So Samantha Al-Hoof, a young self-described fashionista who lives outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, about 15 years ago enters into her local Abercrombie & Fitch at a mall in Tulsa seeking a job, gets very highly rated as a candidate, but there's just one problem. Can anybody guess what it is? The article she's wearing on her head. She gets downgraded because of that, ends up not getting the job, sues. Abercrombie says that it is against their look policy for somebody to wear an article on their head, and plus they claim they didn't understand it was a religious article. 8-1 Supreme Court verdict written by Scalia says it doesn't matter if Abercrombie claims they didn't know it was a religious article, it was incumbent upon them to know. This is Antonin Scalia saying that it is the responsibility of every hiring entity in the country, business, government, nonprofit, to know enough about the diverse religions present to be able to detect that an article being worn on somebody's head is religious in nature. It wasn't Samantha's responsibility to say this is religious. It was Abercrombie's responsibility to know. Why do I say this? Because if you run a company, if you run a government agency, if you run a nonprofit organization, you are required to know something about the religious diversity of the nation, according to the Supreme Court. Incidentally, there is another case coming before the Supreme Court, religious identity and employment, a mail carrier who has been required to work on Sundays when he says that as an evangelical Christian that violates his Sabbath. My big point is that for all of the attention we give to other important dimensions of identity, and they are hugely important, race, gender, sexuality, all of these are important. We give scant attention to religious identity, and in American jurisprudence, it is probably the central identity from constitutional law to current, from the Constitution to current Supreme Court cases. But the purpose of my organization, as you could see from the video, is not just to mitigate the bad stuff, right? We don't lean into our religious diversity as a nation just so we don't get sued. I don't want you to get sued, trust me, but I want us to be Interfaith America. I want us to be bridging our religious social capital. I want us to be sharing our inspiration with each other. And there's another great corporate America example that shows us this can be done. And that's the example of Nike and the Victory line of clothing. So Martha Moore, Senior Vice President at Nike, is on the beach one day, and she notices that a particular group of women isn't going into the water, and that they have clothes that go, they have shirts that go to their wrists, and pants that go to their ankles on the beach on a hot day. She discerns correctly. There's probably a religious ethos behind this. Thinks to herself, those are probably Muslim women. Does some quick math. There's 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. If half of them are women, that's 750 million women. If even half of those women abide by those particular standards of modesty, we're talking about 375 million people. It's a pretty sizable market. Somebody should design for them. That's where you get this new clothing line, worn by people like Ibtihaj Muhammad when she competes in the Olympics. And incidentally, this isn't just Muslim women. There are plenty of Orthodox Jewish women, LDS women, evangelical women, Hindu and Buddhist women who would not feel comfortable in Western-style bathing suits. If we pay attention to that dimension of identity, if we lean into it with what businesses do well, design products and services that meet the needs of different kinds of people, we actually do well for our companies and elevate populations that have otherwise been forgotten. Simple lesson here. Don't be Abercrombie, be Nike, right? Don't get me sued, and let's make sure we are doing the best we can to positively and proactively engage the religious diversity around us. The truth of the matter is, we are not doing a great job of this as a society right now. So the organization I lead, Interfaith America, in addition to working with companies and government agencies and civic organizations, we have a footprint on some 600 campuses. And we conducted a couple of years ago the largest study ever done on higher education and religious diversity. 120 campuses, 20,000 plus students, 3 administrations. And one of the questions we asked to these 20,000 plus students is, what dimensions of identity do you spend a lot of time learning about? So look at every blue graph there. It's above 60%. Students, more than 60% of students say they spend quite a bit of time learning about different sexualities, really positive thing. People of different politics, really positive thing. People from different nations and races and ethnicities, really positive thing. I think every single one of those identities really matters. And when it comes to religion, everything is under 50%. So if you think about colleges and universities as kind of a demonstration for what we think is important to know about in the country, like you send, colleges decide the kind of knowledge that's important, it imparts that knowledge to the next generation and the country moves forward. We don't think that learning about religion is that important. But why not? When you consider the civic contribution of our faith communities, when you consider the central importance it plays in constitutional law, when you consider the ways that our companies can elevate the nation by leaning into this. So here's the really good news that I'm going to leave you with. Chicago has a great tradition of this, right? We're the nation that invents the skyscraper and deep dish pizza and hot dogs eaten the right way, and depending on your politics, Saul Alinsky-style community organizing or Milton Friedman-style economics. And we're also really the city that gives the nation interfaith cooperation, right? So Muhammad Ali's Muslim faith develops here. Jane Addams starts one of the early civic institutions that welcomes Jews, Catholics, and Protestants in what she calls a cathedral of humanity, bound by the fellowship of the deed. Obama begins his career here as a community organizer, working with Protestant, Catholic, and Muslim communities under the tutelage of a Jewish mentor. When he wins the presidency and goes on Inauguration Day, I'm standing there with 2 million of my fellow citizens in January 2009, and Obama says, our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, of Hindus and Jews and non-believers. And because we have been through the darkest chapters, we know that what unites us is more important than what divides us. That's the ethic he gets here. And it all launches in 1893 at the Parliament of the World's Religions. You walk into the Art Institute on the Michigan side, don't get bit by the lions, walk through the gates, turn to your left, and there is Fullerton Hall. And you'll see an image of Swami Vivekananda, the young Hindu monk who gives the rousing address at the first Parliament of the World's Religions, hosted here in Chicago in 1893. Because even at that time, the great and good of the city of Chicago, the folks who gathered at places like the Economic Club, they knew that the world was getting more religiously diverse, and that diversity was coming to Chicago, and they wanted to use it to build the architecture of their city. And so I'll leave you with the last lines of the Parliament of the World's Religions. In Chicago in 1893, our forefathers and foremothers said, from now on, the great religions of the world make war no longer on each other, and instead on the giant ills that afflict humankind. That is our charge. Thank you.
It's really amazing to see and think about religion and how really America was built on this idea of interfaith, and how much great work is really in the United States has been driven by religion. And before I go into this, I just want to remind people, I think there are cards, right? Or you see Katie walking around there. We do want to make this interactive because we have a smaller group. I think it's really affords us to be able to do that. So if you have a question, I have plenty to ask, but I want to make sure that we get questions from the audience as well. So I'll keep an eye out for that. So before we go into religion, really, I wanted to start with, in your new book, you write about your own journey from being a student activist to really a social change agent. And I think it would be great to hear more about that journey and how it led you to becoming really what is now movement leader.
Yeah, so I grew up in Glen Ellen, which is basically 25 miles due west from here. I went to Glen Bart South High School and then the University of Illinois. My first year in college was 1993, and I became a hair on fire activist. And the people I kind of fell in with at the beginning was kind of an angry variety of activists. When I think about it, we hated the system more than we loved people, right? And this was me at 18 or 19. And it took me a couple.
What drove? What kind of sparked that?
I think Glen Ellen at the time was very white, and I am not. And I think that there was a whole series of ugly racisms that I experienced that I didn't have language for in high school. And this was the early 90s was actually an era of kind of racial consciousness that feels similar to today. And the language that I learned around racism and discrimination in college, I immediately gravitated towards. And the positive thing of that is that there's a dimension of that that's true. The negative thing is I made it my whole life, and it wasn't my whole life. Most of my life has been really blessed. And most of my experience in America has been really blessed. And one can point out the things that aren't blessed and say this can improve. But when I was 18 or 19, I didn't have the nuance to be able to do that. And so I raged. And I think that there is kind of a school of social change that basically says, if you are angry enough and burn down the system, then something better will descend in its place. And when I think about that now, it doesn't make very much sense, especially as somebody who's built an organization over 20 years, nothing just happens, right? Everything is built painstakingly. I missed that lecture in my sociology class when I was 18. But what winds up happening is I have the enormous good fortune of after that kind of period of activism, running into somebody who says out of the blue to me, have you ever heard of Dorothy Day? Have you ever heard of Dorothy Day? And I hadn't, but it turns out that there was an institution founded by Dorothy Day in my college town, a Catholic worker house of hospitality. And I went there, and it was different than any other social service agency that I'd ever been a part of. And it was basically an institution built to the idea of the kingdom of God by somebody who was unabashedly a person of faith. And it kind of kicks off this spiritual journey for me of learning about the approach to social change in a variety of faith traditions, ultimately bringing me back to the faith tradition that I was raised in, which is the Ismaili Muslim community, but with a deep recognition that religion has been a major enrichment to the American project, that it is a powerful model of social change that is just too seldom discussed. And the model is basically you articulate an ideal, the kingdom of God, the intersection of, in Muslim terms, deen and dunya, faith and world, and then you build institutions to that ideal. So instead of the notion of what do I not like about things, and how do I get good at telling you what you're doing wrong, which is how I began as a social change agent, you instead say, what were we meant to be? What did God make us to be? And how do we live into that with the fullness that is possible?
So would you say that what prompted you, because I'm really curious about this, because I think this is really important, is the anger, right? This activist anger, and where you were, the prompt of switching from that angry activist to being a movement builder, and leader. Do you think that was Dorothy Day?
She was the active element, yes. But in my
which is ironic, right? Because
totally ironic. I mean,
angry
I remember
Muslim Indian.
My PhD is actually on my own Muslim community, and I would go back and I would tell my parents, I'm like, and then there's Rumi, and then the Aga Khan gave this address, and then Avicenna, and my parents were like, we taught you all that when you were 9. You just didn't listen to anything, And now I'm a dad. I have a 13 and a 15-year-old. I'm like, this is like total karma, right? But the truth is, I was raised in a house in which faith was inspiring, in which we're constantly pointing to examples of positive institution building of our religious community, in which, growing up in Glen Ellen, Wheaton College is nearby. My parents had great respect for that institution. My dad went to Notre Dame. In other words, I was raised with a deep respect of how religion inspires people to do better things. I just ignored it for a long time,
And, and I think that happens to many of us as we grow up, right? We start to mature and our thinking starts to mature. Since you started, since you started Interfaith America and this movement, how has your, view of religion and diversity, you started to talk about this in your presentation, really evolved over time?
Yeah. So I think Interfaith America is not just a religious diversity organization, right? Mm-hmm. We begin our engagement with religious diversity, and in that, you recognize that there is a paradigm of diversity that is useful across identity categories. So number one, people's identities are inspirations. Begin with that, right? Begin with the idea that people's identities are inspirations. Hating Islamophobia is not more important to me than loving Islam, right? Mm-hmm. People's race, their gender, their sexuality, their faith is an inspiration for who they are. It inspires their contribution. Begin with that. The second thing is try to bring people together around that inspiration, right? So constantly look at the bridging mechanism across identities. And I would say the third thing is recognize that diversity is not just the differences that you like. And that if we're going to have a functioning diverse democracy, you're going to have to learn how to disagree on some fundamental things to work together on other fundamental things. And for us, that paradigm emerges out of an engagement around religious diversity, right? Number one, think of people's identities first and foremost as an inspiration. Number two, create spaces where it is easier for people to cooperate. And number three, recognize that we're not going to agree on everything, and that is part of the definition of diversity. And in order to be able to function as a society, you disagree on some fundamental things, and you work together on others.
So this is something that you write about quite frequently, and you have written that we, with the people with whom we disagree is essentially the essence of what it means to live in a pluralistic democratic society. And that should be the ball game. But why do you think it's been so difficult for us? It looks like in the 1700s, it was almost easier than it is today.
I mean, there's this thing called the internet, and it makes most of us worse. So there's a beautiful line by Dorothy Day, which is to create spaces where it is easier for people to be good, right? Mm-hmm. Create spaces where it is easier for people to be good. And my permutation on that is create spaces where it is easier for people to cooperate. And there's a group of people out there called conflict entrepreneurs who are like literally pointing out places where people should fight and then encouraging them to fight. Mm. And we basically need 100 times more bridge builders saying, no. What you have in common, right? How your diverse faiths inspire you to do good, whether that's be a healer at a hospital or coach Little League or be a part of an environmental effort, that is way more important. And so we're going to come together around that. We're going to create a space where it is easier for people to cooperate and where the The difference that you have is not unimportant, but it is framed under the cooperative relationship, right? Look at us cooperating in coaching this little league team together. We now have a format in which we can discuss our disagreement around, say, immigration, right? And by the way, did you think we weren't going to disagree? Right? Did you think that diversity was just samosas and egg rolls? Of course not. There's a reason that this is called the American experiment, right? A huge part of the experiment is that people from the four corners of the earth, praying to God in different ways, including not at all, speaking different languages, call this their political and civic home. That is a major experiment, right? And we're going through a particularly intense phase of that right now.
Yeah.
And we got to be, the Jane Addamses of our time.
Right. I mean, there is so much polarization today in our democracy. And, and just going back to your comment about collaboration, there is a view that collaboration is capitulation in some extremes, or, in particular where like fundamental rights are at stake. What do you say, about that in the context of Interfaith America?
So, one of the things I love about engaging with the business community is your big question is, show me how it works well, and let's go do more of that, right? Like
we did see that in the Nike.
Yeah.
The commercial aspect of it.
At the end of the day, it has to work, right? And the truth is, American diversity works in lots of places that are super inspiring. Every hospital in 10 square miles of here is a place of inspiring religious, racial, ethnic, ideological diversity, right? Like walk onto any floor and there is a Hindu doctor supported by a Muslim anesthesiologist working with a Jewish nurse in a room that's sanitized by a Jehovah's Witness at a hospital founded by a Catholic order, run by a secular humanist who grew up Buddhist. And that's like everywhere. That's not the exception, that's the rule, right? And so you think to yourself, okay, there are contexts in which people with very different identities and ideologies cooperate in very meaningful ways. Let's do more of this. Athletics is another example. So, you're constantly finding examples of how does this work well? Is there a secret sauce? And let's go do more of it. And right now, I think that the reality of American cooperation is much better than the narrative around it. Right? There have been times in history where we have told ourselves a story of cooperation when actually we've been living in eras of civic conflict. The truth is, the reality of American cooperation, hospitals would cease to function if people said, actually, I can't work with you because of your view on the size of government or because you believe in salvation in a different way than I do, right?
Yeah.
And so what if we told the American story of cooperation based on the many good places where it goes well?
Yeah, and I do think that's what makes America beautiful too, is that you do have all of this divergent religion now. I know you have to stay motivated on this mission every day, and it's incredibly inspiring, and it's a wonderful reminder of all the things that is good about America. But what worries you most about the triangular intersections of religion, diversity, and democracy?
I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and I used to send emails at 5:30 in the morning, 2002, 2003, when I was just starting. I'm looking at my executive team who's here. When do my first emails arrive these days? About 5:30 in the morning. I don't have trouble staying motivated, right? Like there's too much good stuff in the world, and there's too much bad stuff in the world. And like, alhamdulillah, we're alive, right? Like, what's not to be motivated about? Honestly, like, what's not to be motivated about? So, I don't have trouble staying motivated. I am concerned that we are not telling the story of American religion as an inspiring story. I'm concerned that we're not telling the story of American diversity as an inspiring story. I'm concerned that the negative take is considered sophisticated.
So, I mean, along those lines, what I would tell you is I grew up, and I think it's very like cliche to say this, but we were all kind of taught, don't talk about politics and don't talk about religion. And I do feel as Americans, over time, maybe we've been taught to tiptoe a little bit around religion. And I think it might even, it extends into the workplace. You started to talk about how, religion really is a big part, I think, of DEI, but it's not implemented, right, completely in our programs. And you've argued that religion is the missing piece in institutional diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, like, how do we overcome that? Because I think that's something as leaders, we're all in the, talking about leadership in the room.
Yeah.
What do we do?
I mean, look, you need a positive, public, proactive language around faith, right? And it's people were like, yeah, man, what you say, like, that's important, but dude, like, religion, it's really hard. I'm like, yeah, race, super easy, I mean, it's just, it's like, are you willing to do the work, right? And look, I think we live in the city of Chicago. People have been doing the work here since 1893, right? This is the city where the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. met the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel in 1963. This is the city where Julius Rosenwald met Booker T. Washington. And they worked together to build like hundreds and hundreds of schools for African Americans in the South. Do you know that at one time, a third of black kids in school in the racist early part of the 20th century were in a Rosenwald school? That's built in partnership with Booker T. Washington by the Jewish guy in Chicago who went to Temple Sinai, whose Rabbi Emil Hirsch was like, look, man, time to start doing something like God ordained with your fortune, right? So he didn't need to put his name on Sears Roebuck. What he did was put his stamp on American civil society, right? So, like, we live in the city that for earlier eras created a positive public language around religious diversity. We should do our part in the early 21st century. We should run our leg of the race.
And I agree with you, but this has been, I think, developing these diversity, equity, inclusion plans. It does take an incredible amount of effort, buy-in from all constituents, and maybe just help us understand, in your view, how do we incorporate religious diversity, into the way that we think about and execute our DEI plans?
Yeah, so, look, that's what we do. That's one of the things Interfaith America does. So if you're interested, talk to us. That's what we do. But, like, simply put,
you'll start getting tons of emails today.
Right. We're happy to get tons of emails.
Yeah.
Simply put, don't be Abercrombie, be Nike. Right? Don't be Abercrombie, be Nike. And you know what? The beginnings of it is not that hard. Have a radar screen for religious diversity. Just expect your employee base and your customer base to be religiously diverse. Just expect it. And know that people's religious identities guide what they wear, how they eat, where they vacation, how they marry, how they get buried. It affects everything. So just prepare for this, right? And if you just lean into it even just a little bit, if somebody at Abercrombie had just asked the question, do you think that that's a fashion statement that she's making? Or do you think that maybe there's something else going on? I mean, it happened in 2007, right? Like, just Google it. If you have even a modicum of curiosity about the people around you, you will quickly notice that diverse religious identities are present, often in super inspiring ways. So I'll give you like one little thing to pay attention to that will make your day better. If you're in a cab or an Uber, look to see if there is some kind of a symbol near where the driver sits. Is there an Om? Is there the Arabic of Allah? Is there a cross? Is there an image of a guru? Just look at that, right? And you think to yourself, like, that is this person's protection, right? There is an image of a Greek Orthodox saint. My Uber driver, that is a protection for her, right? That, like, just noticing that, and you thinking to yourself, so this plays out in the lives of everybody from doctors to diplomats in fascinating and in interesting and in frustrating ways, but you prepare for it. Right? There are plans, there are ways of executing those plans, et cetera, but it begins with what we call having a radar screen for religious diversity.
And really, it sounds like, you talked a little bit about the universities and the education system that we have that is not really as focused on religious diversity today. But I think that starts, but it also, I think, is incumbent on us as leaders to educate ourselves.
One of the interesting things about colleges and universities when it comes to this, and by the way, there are plenty that do this really, really well. So Donna Carroll, who is the president of Dominican University for many, many decades, right? She built the model campus at Dominican that wove in attention to religious diversity from like day one of first year orientation to a requirement to get your MSW, and she put it as part of their accreditation package. There's people from Loyola here, same at Loyola. Sally Blunt was the dean at the Kellogg School at Northwestern. When Morty Shapiro was president there was a deep engagement of religious diversity, right? So I don't mean to, my point here is not to castigate higher education on this. It is to say that identity issues are very important in higher education right now. And of those identity issues, religion is far and away the Pluto of the planets, right? Yeah. Maybe it's in the galaxy, maybe it's not, but it's definitely the smallest one. It's definitely the smallest one. And given the very important role that religious identity and diversity plays in our society, right? From civil society to American law, it just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. So think about this for a second. If you're like in the human services, right? If you're a sociology major or you're getting an MSW or something like that, and your first job is going to be at a human services organization, human services institution, there's like a 90% chance, unless you work for the government, that it's going to be at a place founded by a faith community. It'd be like good if your college or university prepared you for that. People, I meet some young activist types and they're like, yeah, man, like religion, it just does nothing good. I'm like, yeah, where do you work again? They're like, Lutheran World Service. I'm like, oh yeah, nothing good. Religion does nothing good, right? But it is said with a straight face because the dots have not been connected between Catholic charities and the Catholic Church. Where do you think Catholic Charities comes from? Right? It comes from people deeply inspired by their faith who have an image of the kingdom of God and are doing everything they can to build it on earth. And by the way, I'm not Catholic, Right. I just admire the tradition and I admire the contribution.
And it is amazing. I sit as the chair of the National Philanthropic Trust. We're one of the largest donor-advised fund managers in the world, and so we track where philanthropy goes. And in the U.S., in 2021, there was $480 billion of philanthropic dollars that was donated that year. And if you look across the different categories, social services, healthcare, education, a big portion of that comes from religiously driven organizations, even though they don't say religion. The direct donations to religious organizations are also very large, but they're not correlated with those three other areas, which you can imagine. So we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to open it up for audience questions. So many hands going up. Okay, so we've got one here. I see two. All right, we might not be able to get to all of them, but.
Hi, Ebu. My name's Jason Coulter. I'm the senior minister of First Congregational Church of Evanston. And I took a course with you at Chicago Theological Seminary many years ago. One of the things many Christian communities are concerned with is the rise of nuns, people who do not choose religious affiliation. And I know this is a concern for people of all faith communities. How do you think this will impact the religious diversity landscape? And any thoughts on what religious leaders can do to address it?
Yeah. Good to see you again. Thank you for coming. Thanks for bringing congregants. I appreciate you. So just to say, at our shop at Interfaith America, we have about 50 full-time staff. We work with, tens of thousands of folks. For us, it's atheist or Zoroastrian, right? So if you're a spiritual seeker, if you're a Sunni Muslim, if you're a Reformed Jew, equal seat at the table, right? We welcome your voice and we welcome your contribution. We recognize people are inspired by all sorts of things. So having said that, I want to say that there's no doubt that this is going to, if the trends continue, this is going to have a deleterious effect on American civil society, right? Because the Catholic school, where 50% of the kids are non-Catholic and where a third of them are poor, right? If people stop going to the Catholic Church and tithing, the school atrophies. Like, the money comes from participation, right? And that's a huge part of our civil society. So I'm concerned about that. And it is not, that comment is not about any individual's religious decision, which I support, right? You get to be who you are. But as a general society, if half of our social capital is generated by religious communities and those communities are atrophying, you don't have to be a genius to know that that's going to have an impact, right? So what's to do? I mean, one thing to do is to just recognize that very few lines in American history go like this, right? That very few lines are like straight lines. Like, most things in American history go like this. So this is the geek that I am, is like, I remember data points around this across history. But if you ask people in 1957, how important is religion in America, 75% said very important. That number fell to 13% in 1967, the height of the hippie era, and it was back up to the 50s 10 years later, right? And so religion in America goes like this. This is why we have a number of great awakenings. It's a kind of a time that religion gets juiced after a kind of a fallow time. So what would be like my advice on this, which is not what you asked? In fact, you maybe didn't even ask that when you were a student, but I'm going to give it to you free anyway. Religion has to be inspiring. It has to be inspiring. That doesn't mean it's easy, right? Like, I love Bonhoeffer's idea of the cost of discipleship, but it has to be inspiring. We should talk about how inspiring it is. My faith, your faith, the faith of other folks, the faith of folks we know well, the faith of folks we don't know well. It's inspiring, right? And I feel like we are soft pedaling the inspiring dimensions of religion, and we are lifting up the dark parts. There are dark parts, but I don't want people to live. Why would I be louder about the dark parts than I am about the light parts, right? I want people to live into the good stuff, so I need to talk about it.
I see. Hi, Ebo. It's Sally Blount, and thank you for holding up Catholic Charities' work and the work of all our peer organizations that are founded by religious orders. Dorothy Day has inspired many of us in this room across many religions. I think one of the things that troubles me most on the topic that you were touching on of the nuns is there's also this growing attempt by the social sciences to explain religion away. I don't know if you've seen the recent book by Dr. Keltner called Awe. And he basically tries to make the experience that we have in the religious life of awe and wonder, he tries to break it down into biological terms, and basically it tells people that they should go for awe walks and that they should just become aware of the healing power of awe in their lives. And I do think that part of what hinders us, and I'm getting to my question for you, is how do we help enable people to talk about why religion matters? I mean, we have to be inspiring about it, but I think people are scared to talk about the underpinnings of why it matters and why it matters to civil society. And again, they prefer more comfortable, they'd rather talk about science than meaning in a religious context. So how do you help us with that? Because I think we need your help and your inspiration.
I'm in favor of all walks, and what I mean by that is like I'm in favor of whatever scientific basis there might be for our feelings of awe and love and whatever else. Like, let's find that out. I'm in favor of it, but nothing for me is more awesome than the notion that God created us through a lump of clay in his breath and told us that we are his Abd and Khalifa, his servant and representative on earth, and that it is our job to steward creation. And then he called the angels forth, and the angels said, why would you honor a creature who will only fiddle and destroy? And God says, I know what you do not know. Nothing will replace that for me, right? In like my sense of what am I meant to do, right? And I want to know what that is for you in your religion, right? And the fact that you have that in your tradition doesn't take it away from mine, right? The fact that Maimonides inspired you to become a doctor as a Jew only enriches my sense that Averroes was a great healer that inspired Muslims to become doctors, right? And I think that way of thinking and talking, which is, I am part of a great story in the world, a cosmic story in which I am inspired, required, and commanded to do good. And I'm Rahmatul Alameen, a special mercy upon all the worlds, as God says to the Prophet Muhammad, right? So what is that for you? And how do we do it together? By the way, this is a totally familiar language in the American idiom. It is totally familiar. This is like Frederick Douglass through King. This is, Kennedy through Obama. It is totally familiar. And for whatever reason, it's atrophied in the past couple of years. Fine. We're the ones to bring it back.
I have a question that's a little bit more pragmatic. We know that we're going to get the Democratic National Convention in '24. So how does this group of leaders here make sure that we can promote the light and not the dark, and talk about what unites us and not what divides us? How can we help promote Chicago as a great city?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm just gonna riff for a second here, right? Like, we talk about ourselves as the 21st century city on a hill, right? From this glorious Baha'i temple, of which there are only, 7, 8, 9 in the world, to the storefront church on the west side of Chicago that saves lives, that enriches young people, that bring folks together. We're the 21st century city on a hill, right? We are a Sangha on pilgrimage, and we make sure that our identities are both sources of pride and bridges of cooperation. And what Chicago did for the world in 1893 at the Parliament of the World's Religions, and what Jane Addams did for Chicago, and what Obama did for Chicago, we're going to do again for the nation and the world. That's what we talk about, and we live into that, right? But as Walter Lippmann said, the story will govern at any given time what human beings will do. So we have to tell the story of possibility, and then we have to live into that. And again, one of the things that concerns me the most right now is pointing out the negative is considered sophisticated. My friend Lori Patton, who's the president of Middlebury, she's like, people who say the glass is half empty, like, they're constantly, people who say the glass is half full, the optimists, they're constantly called naive, right? You're only telling the half truth. Well, the pessimists are only telling the half-truth too, right? So I'd much rather be an optimist. I would much rather be the person who says, show me the 10 places in the world that are a positive reflection of God's vision. If they can do it, we can do it. So let's go do more of it. It's certainly possible, right? If they're doing it, we can do it.
Question here.
Ebu, great to see you.
Nice to see you, Mike.
I want to follow up on Sally's comment on inspiring talk of religion. I know you mentioned Lori Patton. We saw her at Duke University, yes, I think a number of years ago. So maybe some best practices for inspiring religious talk at universities, but also companies. A few companies really are driving toward a quote-unquote faith-friendly environment. So any advice on that would be much appreciated.
Yeah. So
Great to see you.
Right. Nice to see you. Mike, thank you for being a supporter and a friend for 20 years for Interfaith America. And there's so many people in this room who have been that. Kim Duchessois, Jess Green, Steve Edwards, Donna Carroll, just lots and lots of people who have who've helped us go from 8 voices in my head to the largest interfaith organization in the country. So we appreciate it. We're very proud to be from Chicago. My guy Sonny Garg, thank you for convincing David to take a meeting with me. Appreciate that. So I think you begin with the framework, right, which is the recognition that getting religious diversity matters wrong is going to land you in a soup of trouble. And getting them right is about new markets, new products, new ways of thinking, new ways of engaging, and your employee base and your customer base is already religiously diverse. Are you leaning into that in the most positive and proactive way? So I would just ask yourself the simple question. Do you have a sense of the religious diversity of your employee base and your customer base? And if you did, could you think of 3 versions of Nike victory wear that you would immediately do if you knew, for example, that 22% of your customers were Muslim and the vast majority of Muslims don't eat pork, and you run a company in food service? What would you do, right? And there's lots of versions of this. I'll tell you a quick story on this. So speaking of Baylor University, I fly into, I think it's Dallas Airport. I'm doing that 90-minute drive to Waco, and you cannot do that drive without stopping at roadside barbecue, right? So I stop at this roadside barbecue place 20 miles outside of Waco. I walk in, and every head in the place turns. I swear to God, Ted Nugent is playing through the, in Fox News is everywhere, and I'm all right. For the next 45 minutes, my name is going to be Sam and not Eboo, And I go up to the food counter, barbecue place, so it's all out there, right? And nothing is labeled. The general meat is labeled, but in barbecue, people figure out how to get pig into everything, right? And in Chicago, they'll tell you the collard greens have bacon, but the mac and cheese doesn't, right? So I'm trying to figure out what's what. And there's 11 burly dudes in overalls behind me. And I'm about to walk out because I'm not going to eat pork, but I can't figure out what's what. So the woman behind the counter looks at me and says, "Sweetheart, you can eat this, this, and this." I'm like, "Thank you." She puts it on my plate and she looks at me and smiles and she's like, "Everybody's got to eat," right? So she knew. Right? She knew, I wasn't I'm a Muslim, Salaam alaikum, don't eat pork. Can I have the yams? I'm not doing that 20 miles outside of Waco, But she had a radar screen for religious diversity. She knew something was going on. She knew that it was probably not just a preference thing. She knew there was probably a conviction thing, and she helped, right? And that version of that at the C-suite of companies with religiously diverse employees and religiously diverse customers, that will help your business and that will help America.
Well, I think that's, on that note, really, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Economic Club of Chicago and everyone in this room, Eboo, for your time, your thought leadership, and really making us think and challenging I think us to be better leaders in our organizations, both for our companies, our community, and for Chicago. And so I'm very proud to have you and Interfaith America as part of Chicago. So just join me in a round of applause.
Thank you.